They called her Rosanna Rose Wilcox, a lone woman with a spine of steel and a heart big as the plains. Most frontier folk knew her only by reputation. The young widow who ran a sprawling ranch near the Comanche border alone. One crisp morning, she stumbled upon a lost Comanche boy, cornered by snarling coyotes, and in saving him, she changed her life forever. Days later, thunder rolled across the prairie, not a storm, but the pounding hooves of 100 warriors. They had come for the child. They had come for justice, or maybe for gratitude. In that moment, everything changed. In the waning light of a late spring evening in 1878, Rosanna Rose Wilcox guided her sorrel mare, Daisy, across the rolling Texas plains. Her father, the late John Wilcox, had staked a claim on 20,000 acres near the Brazos River years before, right on the cusp of Comanche territory. Since his passing and the unexpected death of her husband, Lawrence Wilcox, Rose had inherited the burden of managing the Wilcox Ranch and all its responsibilities. By any measure, it was a hard life for a woman alone. Yet Rose had grit. She clung to the land with fierce determination, driven by loyalty to her family's legacy. From the porch of her modest ranch house, Rose often looked east, imagining the faraway city lights of Fort Worth she'd glimpsed once before. But the rolling horizon, shimmering under the hot Texas sun, was home. The local farmers and ranchers had formed a close-knit community, in part for protection. The region was known for more than just its rattlesnakes and outlaws. Tensions with the Comanche were not as violent as in decades past, but they still flared when settlers pushed too close to tribal hunting grounds. Rose had heard stories of the famed Charles Goodnight, the legendary cattleman who drove herds along the Goodnight-loving trail and negotiated alliances with various tribes. She wished she had his charisma, or Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie's unwavering authority to keep skirmishes at bay. But as a ranch woman with no illusions about the hardships of frontier life, Rose had to rely on careful planning, a steady aim with her Winchester, and a willingness to treat others, whether white settler or Comanche warrior, with respect. Little did she know that one fateful day her path would cross with a child who would bring her face to face with an entire band of mounted Comanche riders. Drought had parched the land for weeks. The local creek that wound through Rose's property was reduced to a trickle. With water scarce, the small community near the Wilcox Ranch prayed nightly for relief from the skies. Sometimes Rose rode into the dusty settlement known as Buckshot Springs, named for a skirmish that had taken place there years before between bandits and Texas Rangers. No saloon, no church, just a few clapboard houses, a smithy and a single mercantile owned by the no-nonsense Jeremiah Whitley. It was there, amid sacks of flour and stacks of rifle cartridges, that Rose occasionally overheard tensions stirring. Word had reached Buckshot Springs that Quanah Parker, a famed Comanche leader, son of Cynthia Ann Parker, was forging alliances with smaller Comanche bands who resented the continuing push of ranchers onto their diminishing territory. There were rumors of raiding parties, but also rumors of peaceful negotiations. Nobody knew which story to believe. Some insisted the cavalry from Fort Concho would ride out and address any trouble. Others claimed that bandit groups masquerading as Comanche were the real threat. Rose had a simpler perspective. She saw the Comanche as people with a right to survive in the only home they had ever known. She wanted no bloodshed on her land. She had only a handful of ranch hands, 3 men who looked to her for pay and direction. Pete Montgomery was the foreman, an aging yet robust cowboy who had known her father. Two younger Wrangler's brothers, Tom and Earl Jacobs, handled the daily chores, patching fences, moving cattle to better grass, and sleeping under the stars. Everyone walked on eggshells. The unknown could be more terrifying than the known. Rose sensed something simmering beneath the surface. She tried to keep her ranch afloat, unaware that her personal frontier dilemma was about to become far more urgent and complicated than she had ever imagined. It was early morning when Rose decided to ride the perimeter of her land to check for stray cattle. A faint pink sunrise painted the horizon. She pulled on her faded leather gloves, mounted Daisy, and set off across the fields. The tall prairie grass whispered around them, the gentle wind carrying a hint of cedar from the nearby groves. Far from the ranch house, closer to the rocky outcrops near the riverbank, she heard an unsettling noise, the high-pitched yip of coyotes. Daisy pricked her ears, clearly uneasy. Rose reined the mare to a stop and listened more closely. The yips morphed into frenzied snarls. At first she thought it was just a pack devouring a carcass, nature's harsh cycle. But then she heard another sound, a child's terrified scream. Her heart thundered in her chest. Without hesitation, Rose spurred Daisy and galloped toward the commotion. The coyotes came into view, on a slight rise, silhouettes outlined against the pale sky. They were circling something or someone. She heard the frantic cries again, a boy's voice, high and shrill with panic. Rose had never faced down more than one coyote at a time, but she didn't think twice. She drew her Winchester from the saddle scabbard and fired a warning shot into the air. The coyotes froze, yellow eyes glaring. She dismounted, leveled the rifle at the nearest coyote, and fired again. A sharp yelp confirmed her shot had found its mark. The rest scattered, skulking away from the scene. As the dust and adrenaline settled, Rose stepped forward. Lying on the ground, dazed, scratched, and trembling, was a young Comanche boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. He looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes. In that instant, Rose knew her life and his had changed forever. The boy's face was streaked with dirt and tears, his clothes torn. Blood oozed from a shallow gash on his arm, probably from a coyote's teeth. He flinched as Rose knelt beside him, her rifle in one hand, the other hand outstretched. She spoke gently, though she knew only a handful of Comanche words. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." He winced, recoiling as if expecting further harm. Her heart clenched at the sight. How many encounters with settlers had ended badly for a child like him? She motioned with her hand, mimicking the action of tending to his wound. Slowly the boy's gaze shifted from terror to cautious trust. He let her press a clean handkerchief against the wound to staunch the bleeding. Checking him for additional injuries, Rose found bruises on his legs, probably from tumbling down an embankment. She offered him water from her canteen. He sipped gingerly. The child muttered something in Comanche that she didn't fully understand. She caught a word that might have been father or help. Nothing was certain, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. Gently she lifted the boy, who clung to her with surprising strength. Daisy snorted, but stood steady as Rose eased the child onto the saddle. Concern furrowed Rose's brow. She had no idea how far from home this boy was, or how he'd ended up lost and alone at the mercy of coyotes. Time seemed to slow each second, underscoring a new reality. In saving him, she had obligated herself heart and soul to his fate. The boy gazed at her with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The short ride back to the ranch felt momentous. They were strangers, tied by a single act of compassion, unaware of the trouble and the hope that would soon gallop onto her land. When Rose arrived at the Wilcox ranch with the boy cradled in front of her, the ranch hands rushed over in confusion. Pete Montgomery, tall and grizzled, removed his weathered hat and gave the boy a searching look. The Jacobs brothers stiffened, uncertain how to react. A lost Comanche child on Wilcox land was unprecedented. "Miss Rose." "You all right?" Pete asked quietly. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. "But he's hurt. Get some water heated." The men exchanged glances. They'd heard the rumors of tribal tensions. Bringing a Comanche child into the ranch could set off a firestorm of retaliation if his people got the wrong impression. Yet none of them argued with Rose's decision. She was in charge, and her moral compass rarely led them astray. Inside the ranch house, Rose laid the boy on a cot. Pete retrieved the medical kit, and Rose cleaned and dressed the bite on the child's arm. He squirmed in pain, but allowed her to help his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. They offered him food beans, cornbread, and a bit of jerked beef. After an initial hesitation, hunger won, and he devoured what was offered. He introduced himself in broken words. "Natok," he said, pointing to himself. Rose repeated his name gently. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, trying to convey safety. But she felt the tension swirling around them. If the Comanche boy's family arrived, how would they interpret her actions? Had she just saved a child who was about to be devoured by coyotes, or had she kidnapped a young Comanche? Rumors in frontier towns rarely favored nuance. Outside, the wind stirred the dust, and the Jacobs brothers eyed the horizon. The feeling that something big was about to happen weighed on everyone's minds, but none of them grasped just how explosive the next days would become. Over the next few days, the boy Natok began to mend. The wound on his arm responded well to Rose's makeshift bandaging. He was skittish around the men, but clung to Rose as if she were a protective spirit. She improvised methods to communicate with him, pointing to objects and naming them in English, listening as he repeated them or offered the Comanche term. Slowly, a fragile bond formed. The ranch hands adjusted awkwardly. Earl Jacobs brought fresh blankets, while Tom Jacobs fashioned a small wooden toy horse in an attempt to put Natok at ease. Pete Montgomery kept a watchful eye, reminding everyone that while kindness was good, they had to be prepared if Natok's people arrived in force. "They might see us as kidnappers," Pete warned, "and we don't want to shoot at them or them at us." Despite the heavy undercurrent of anxiety, life on the ranch had to go on. The men still needed to tend cattle and check fences. Rose split her time between overseeing chores and caring for Natok, who began to offer glimpses of a sweet, playful spirit. A few times, she caught him smiling shyly, especially when she served him fresh biscuits. Yet Rose's nights were restless. She would lie in bed, staring at the moonlit ceiling, wondering how she would explain all this if a Comanche war party arrived. Would they understand she had saved Natok's life? Could she communicate her respect? History between settlers and the Comanche was filled with betrayal and bloodshed. The seeds of misunderstanding were easy to sow and hard to uproot. All the while her mind flickered back to that moment, she found him surrounded by snarling coyotes. A lost child with no one else to protect him. A single decision to save him might cost her everything, or lead to a compassion that transcended boundaries. She could only wait and see. 6 days after Rose found Natok, the ranch awoke to an unsettling sight. Pete's shouts broke the dawn quiet idylls, Comanche riders. Before anyone could panic, they saw it was only one rider approaching, not a band. He was tall and powerfully built, wearing buckskins and carrying a lance adorned with feathers. His long, dark hair flowed in the breeze as he reined in his horse near the ranch house. The ranch hands tensed rifles at the ready, but not aimed. Rose stepped forward, her heart pounding. A lump caught in her throat. Was this Natok's father? She raised her hands, palms outward, a universal gesture of peace. The man studied her face, then spoke in a calm yet firm voice. She didn't understand most of his words, but she caught Natok clearly. Rose nodded, gesturing for him to follow. Inside, Natok was sitting on a chair near the fireplace. The moment he saw the Comanche warrior, his face lit with joy. He ran into the man's arms, babbling excitedly in Comanche. Relief mingled with apprehension in Rose's chest. Father and son embraced, tears welling in the warrior's eyes. He looked up at Rose and uttered a solemn tutsayu, a word she suspected meant thank you. The man's name was Tabai, and although their words were limited, the emotions spoke volumes. For nearly an hour, Tabai stayed with Natok, cradling his son, examining the bandaged arm, and murmuring quiet reassurances. Rose offered water and food, which Tabai accepted politely. Then, with an urgent expression, he motioned that he needed to leave, pointing toward the distant horizon. Something was off, though he was grateful to have his son back. He wore a heavy look of concern. He gestured that he would return. Rose sensed that this short visit was merely the calm before a much larger storm of events. 2 days of eerie quiet followed Tabai's departure. Rose felt unsettled. The warmth of reuniting father and son had not erased the tension. The ranch hands went about their tasks, but they kept their rifles within arm's reach. Natok clung to Rose, trusting her as a second parent of sorts. On the morning of the 3rd day, that tension exploded into reality. Pete Montgomery dashed into the barn, yelling for Rose and the Jacobs brothers. Riders on the ridge. More than we can count, Comanche. They all rushed outside. On the distant slope, a massive group of warriors sat atop their horses. Feathers and fringes stirring in the wind, lances raised. They were at least 100 strong, maybe more. Rose swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She thought of every story of raids and retaliation she'd ever heard. She thought of the boy at her side, trembling but resolute. At the head of the formation was Tabai, holding his lance high. Next to him, an imposing figure wore a red band around his hair, metal conchos glinting on leather. He radiated authority. Natok whispered something to Rose in a trembling voice. She assumed it might be the name of the leader. Could he be allied with Quanah Parker, or another prominent war chief? Rose cleared her throat, steeled herself, and walked forward alone, arms raised to show she bore no weapon. "Stay back," she whispered to Pete, who nodded. Rifle clutched, but lowered. Step by step she closed the distance. Her mind spun. Was the father returning with a show of force to punish or question her? Or was this an honorable gathering come to formally retrieve Natok? The roar of hooves and the swirl of dust quickly dispelled any illusions. One false move could ignite violence. She prayed they understood her intentions were good. When the cavalry of Comanche riders drew closer, their horses snorting and stamping the air crackled with tension. Tabai dismounted, handing his lance to another warrior. He nodded at Rose, then called out. The tall, commanding figure next to him also dismounted. As they approached on foot, both men studied Rose carefully. She mustered her courage, meeting their gazes without flinching. She spoke softly. "Natok is safe. I saved him from Coyotes." She pointed to the boy who emerged cautiously from behind the barn wall. Even though the Comanche men might not understand every word, the gesture spoke for itself. Tabai explained something to the taller man, who nodded slowly. Then the war chief, for such he seemed, spoke in firm Comanche. Occasionally his words slowed, as if he were searching for the English Rose might know. She gleaned that they were grateful, but also suspicious. There had been rumors that settlers took Comanche children to raise them away from their culture. Tabai gestured earnestly at Rose, evidently insisting she meant no harm. Despite these signs of thanks, the atmosphere grew tense as a group of younger warriors surrounded the ranch yard. They glanced at Rose's men at the corrals. The barn, this was Comanche territory, once, and they were outnumbering the Wilcox ranch by a landslide. Pete and the Jacobs brothers waited anxiously, their fingers near the triggers of their rifles. A single spark could unleash chaos. Rose held up her hands again, calm but unyielding. She had to show them respect, while also protecting her home and people. The discussion turned to talk of safe passage, of whether Rose's ranch and the settlement at Buckshot Springs posed a threat to the Comanche. Rose realized that saving Natok might have bought her a measure of goodwill, but trust between settlers and Comanche was notoriously fragile. One hint of betrayal could turn the entire Parley into a bloodbath. In a surprising move, Tabai approached Natok and led him gently over to the war chief. The child looked back at Rose with uncertainty. The war chief knelt and examined Natok's bandaged arm, running his fingers lightly over the dressing Rose had applied. Natok nodded and said a few words in Comanche, presumably explaining how Rose had cared for him. The war chief rose and fixed his sharp gaze on Rose. He tapped his chest and pronounced his name, Takochi. Then he spoke a few more sentences, pointing at Natok, then at Rose, then at himself. Tabai added his own explanation. From the mixture of gestures and the grave expressions, Rose gathered that Takochi had recognized her compassion. He was not Natok's father, but perhaps a high-ranking leader or a familial elder within the band. Regardless, his word carried weight. A hush fell across the yard. The other warriors observed the interaction. Some wore stern frowns, others seemed curious. Rose guessed that an act of genuine kindness by a settler toward a Comanche child was rare enough to warrant deeper discussion. Or maybe they were deciding how best to proceed, whether to trust her or to suspect a hidden motive. In a gesture of peace, Rose retrieved a small pouch of medicinal herbs from the ranch house comfrey mint and some other dried plants that might help with infection. She offered the pouch to Takochi, hoping he would understand it as a gesture of respect. He accepted it, then spoke a single word of thanks. The tension in the air ebbed slightly, though the warriors still stood guard lances and bows at the ready. Sometimes it is the smallest sign of goodwill, an herbal offering a bandaged wound, a rescued child, that sparks the first spark of trust across a chasm of centuries-old hostility. Rose hoped that spark would hold fast. Late that afternoon, as the sun angled low, Takochi and Tabai conferred with their warriors in Comanche. Rose and her men stood by, aware they were vastly outnumbered. At length, Takochi signaled to Tabai. The father lifted Natok onto his horse. The child glanced back at Rose with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Then Tabai galloped away, followed by most of the warriors. Only Takochi and a handful of elder warriors remained. Rose felt her tension ease. Perhaps they were departing peacefully. Yet when Takochi rode closer and beckoned for Rose, she realized there was more to discuss. He pointed to the south, speaking of Fort Concho, or so it seemed. There was trouble brewing, maybe involving bandits who posed as Comanche to stir hatred. Takochi hinted that violence would sweep these plains if the misunderstandings continued. Whether he was warning her or enlisting her help, Rose couldn't be entirely sure. But she sensed genuine concern in his eyes. After a prolonged silence, Takochi turned and led his riders toward the horizon, leaving a swirl of dust in their wake. Rose exhaled, her heart pounding from the encounter. She turned to see her ranch hands, each pale with lingering fear. Pete spoke first, voice shaking slightly. That was a miracle it didn't come to gunfire, Miss Rose. 100 Comanche riders on our land? He let the thought trail off. Rose nodded. Let's hope it was more than a fluke. They didn't come to raid us, they came for Natok. Tom Jacobs voiced the question all of them were thinking. Do you reckon they'll be back? She looked out over the endless prairie. I don't know, she said, but something tells me we haven't seen the last of Tabe or Takochi, or of the storm they say is coming. A hush settled over the ranch, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Word of the massive Comanche gathering spread quickly through Buckshot Springs. Jeremiah Whitley, the storekeeper, gawked at Rose as she related the story, disbelieving that she and her 3 ranch hands had faced down 100 warriors and lived to tell the tale. The rumor mills churned some folks, labeled Rose a reckless fool for taking in a lost Comanche child. Others called her a saint or an angel of mercy. The wide gulf in sentiment reflected the territory's long-standing animosity and fear toward the tribes. Not everyone was content to let the matter rest. One rancher, Terence Hargrove, had lost livestock recently, and he blamed Comanche raiders, though no evidence pointed directly to them. He ranted loudly in the street that the Wilcox Ranch was now in league with savages. We gotta form a posse, he proclaimed, wipe 'em out before they come for our families. Rose could barely stomach his words. Standing in the mercantile, she challenged Hargrove. You don't know they're the ones who took your cattle. Could be bandits or any number of rustlers. Attacking the Comanche might bring more bloodshed on us all. We need to be sure of the facts. Hargrove spat on the wooden floor, glaring. Tell me, Mrs. Wilcox, how many times have you seen a bandit on a painted pony with war paint on his face? Her gaze never wavered. Times are changing, Mr. Hargrove. We need to find another way. But fear was a powerful ally to hatred. Hargrove and a handful of men stoked the flames, gathering volunteers to patrol the frontier. Rose worried that a single violent encounter, accidental or deliberate, would unravel the fragile trust she'd built with Takochi and Tabai, allies or adversaries. The question hovered over the region, fueling talk of cavalry intervention and the specter of open conflict. Amid the growing unease, Rose often rode the ranch's perimeter, praying she wouldn't stumble upon dead cattle or any sign of hostility. One evening, as dusk settled in a haze of pink and gold, she spotted Stuk rising beyond a distant ridge. Curiosity and worry gnawed at her. She set off at a brisk canter, Daisy's hooves thudding against hard-packed earth. She discovered a trio of riders from Hargrove's so-called posse confronting 2 Comanche scouts beside a small campfire. Anger and fear crackled in the air. One of the scouts had an arrow notched. The other held up a hand in a halting gesture. The posse men brandished rifles, their voices carrying threats on the wind. Without thinking, Rose rode directly into the fray. "Hold your fire!" she shouted. The startled posse turned, momentarily lowering their rifles. Rose positioned Daisy between the men and the Comanche scouts, who recognized her from the Wilcox Ranch incident. She raised her hands to the scouts, hoping to calm them. One of them said, "Natok," as if acknowledging the boy she had rescued. She nodded frantically. "What are you doing here?" Rose barked, one of the posse men, a surly ranch hand from Hargrove's spread. "These Comanche were scoping out our land." Rose glared. "You don't know that. They could be hunting. If you shoot them, you'll bring 100 more riders down on all of us." Her words hung in the twilight. For a moment it seemed as though reason might prevail. But one man, his face red with hatred, or maybe just fear, fired a shot. The bullet kicked up dust near a scout's feet. Instantly the second Comanche raised his bow. Rose shouted again, her heart in her throat. She yanked the surly man's rifle down, spoiling his aim. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, a single misfire away from a bloodbath in the dying light of day. Somehow, the crisis was averted. The Comanche scouts recognized Rose's interference as an effort to prevent violence. They held their fire, though their knuckles whitened around their weapons, then swiftly mounted and vanished into the desert dusk. Shaken Rose turned on the posse. "You want war?" she hissed, voice tight with anger. "Because that's what you'll get if you keep this up." One of the men spat at the ground. "If they come for us, we'll be ready." He trotted off with his companions, leaving Rose alone in the fading light, wrestling with frustration and dread. That night, she barely slept. The next day, she rode out in hopes of finding Tabai, or Takochi, desperate to avoid a larger confrontation. Her perseverance paid off. Far on the horizon, near a dried creek bed, she spotted a cluster of teepees, likely the main camp of Tabai's band. Approaching cautiously, she was challenged by Comanche sentries. It took all her courage and the memory of Natok's rescue to keep her from fleeing. She repeated Tabai's name, hoping they'd understand. Finally, one of the young warriors recognized her. They led her into the camp. The sight was humbling families, going about daily life, children laughing, elders tending fires. Tabai emerged from a lodge, Natok clinging to his hand. The boy ran to Rose, hugging her waist. Tabai nodded gravely, ushering her to a circle of elders, and Takochi himself, who eyed her with curiosity and caution. They seemed prepared to hear her out, a rare privilege for a settler woman in their midst. Rose explained as best she could, in sparse Comanche and gestures that she feared a violent misunderstanding was brewing. Her people were frightened. Some believed the Comanche were behind every theft or raid. She pleaded for mutual restraint, unsure if they grasped the full scope of her desperation. The silence afterward was long and heavy, like a thundercloud hovering on the brink of release. After a tense pause, Takochi spoke. Though Rose could not understand most of his words, Tabai translated where possible. Takochi acknowledged the rising anger among the Comanche, fueled by settlers encroaching on their dwindling land. However, he also recognized that Rose had acted with honor in saving Natok and visiting the camp unarmed to seek peace. The elders conferred quietly, their expressions grave. Then Takochi offered a proposition. The Comanche would refrain from attacking any settler in or around Buckshot Springs, provided the settlers likewise showed restraint. The bandits who disguised themselves as Comanche were a threat to everyone. Takochi insisted that Rose deliver a message. If the settlers continued to meet Comanche with blind aggression, the tribe would retaliate. Rose felt a glimmer of hope. This was more than she had expected. Carefully she nodded, bowing her head to convey respect. She promised to do all she could to prevent escalation among her fellow settlers. In turn, Tabai offered an escort for her safe return. As she mounted, Daisy Natok tugged at her sleeve. He pointed to his chest, then made a small gesture of crossing his arms over his heart an affectionate farewell. She patted his head gently, sorrowful that fate had thrown them together, only to force them back apart. Before leaving, Rose repeated something in Comanche she had practiced, Tanu Utsayu, meaning thank you, friend. The small group looked on with mild surprise, and Tabai smiled. It was a small step toward bridging the divide, perhaps too small in the face of centuries of animosity, but it was a start. Galloping back to her ranch, flanked by 2 Comanche scouts, Rose's mind swirled with urgency. She had to convince Buckshot Springs to stand down. If they refused, war might be inevitable, and if war came, all the trust she'd built would shatter in an instant. The midday sun scorched Buckshot Springs, casting long, sweltering shadows across the dust-choked streets. Sweat glistened on brows and tension hung like a thundercloud ready to burst. Word had spread like prairie fire. Terence Hargrove had rallied nearly 30 ranchers and hired guns, claiming he had proof the Comanche were behind yet another cattle raid. Men on horseback crowded the main road, rifles resting across saddles, pistols at hips. Their faces were hard with suspicion, eyes narrowed against the glare and fear. Marshal Myers was nowhere in sight, out investigating a distant theft, leaving no law but adrenaline and hatred to govern the town. Rose burst into town at a gallop, her hair wind-swept and boots dust-caked from her ride. She pulled Daisy to a halt, flinging herself from the saddle as the mob readied to ride out. She planted herself in the middle of the road, raising her hands high. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice raw with urgency. "You're about to start a war. We won't survive." Hargrove wheeled his horse toward her, scowling. "Get out of the way, Rose. We've had enough of your sympathy for savages. They didn't do this," she shouted back. "I just came from the Comanche camp. They had nothing to do with the stolen cattle. Bandits are out there, men dressing like Comanche trying to pit us against each other." A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. A few men exchanged uncertain glances, but Hargrove wasn't ready to back down. "You're blinded by your bleeding heart," he spat. "You trust their word over your own kind. I trust what I've seen. I saw their families, their children. They want peace more than you do." Before Hargrove could respond, the sound of pounding hooves echoed from the distance. A scout raced into town, barely controlling his panicked steed. "Riders," he cried. "Coming fast." Comanche. Panic rippled through the settlers like wind through tall grass. Men scrambled to check their weapons. Women pulled their children indoors, eyes wide with terror. Rose turned, her stomach twisting. On the ridge beyond the town, a dust plume spiraled into the air. And then, like spirits rising from the earth, 24 Comanche warriors emerged, their silhouettes framed against the sky. At the front rode Tabai. Tall and resolute, followed closely by the dignified figure of Takochi. Their weapons were not raised, but their presence was commanding. Hargrove's men fanned out rifles, shaking in their hands. The confrontation everyone feared was seconds away. "Hold your fire!" Rose cried, running to stand between the town and the advancing riders. "Don't shoot. They're not here to attack." Her heart pounded as the Comanche slowed at the edge of town, hooves stirring dust. Takochi raised his hand, not in threat, but in greeting. Rose stepped forward, trembling but determined. Behind her, the townsfolk held their breath, every finger poised near a trigger. Tabai dismounted first, then Takochi. No weapons were drawn. They stood silently, eyes scanning the crowd. Then Takochi spoke, his voice deep and calm. "We come to speak." The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. Hargrove lowered his rifle an inch. Others followed. Rose turned her voice quieter now. "Let them speak. Let the truth come forward." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if the entire town exhaled at once, rifles began to lower. Not all, but enough. Tabai stepped forward, pointing toward the nearby ridge. "Bandits there, we saw. Took cattle, wore our paint." Takochi added a single word: "Lie." The accusation pierced through the mob like a bullet of truth. Rose glanced toward Hargrove. His lips parted slightly, as if unsure whether to argue or accept what was plain. She turned back to the Comanche. "If you'll help us stop them, maybe this town will finally listen." For the first time in memory, settlers and warriors stood on common ground. And the battle that almost began became something far rarer, an uneasy, unexpected beginning of peace. The air quivered taut with the unspoken threat of violence. Two tense lines faced one another, settlers with rifles clenched in trembling hands, and Comanche warriors with bows drawn and eyes like steel. One spark, one nervous twitch, and blood would stain the dirt of Buckshot Springs forever. Rose didn't hesitate. She rode forward on Daisy, her voice ringing through the air like a thunderclap. "No!" she shouted, throwing herself between the two sides' arms outstretched. Her courage stunned both parties into stillness, the thud of Daisy's hooves, the only sound on that razor's edge of peace or destruction. Then came the first gunshot, but not from either of the lines. The sound cracked from the nearby ridge, followed by several more. Muzzle flashes erupted in the distance, and bullets tore through the air, one zipping past Rose's cheek, so close it drew blood. Another struck the wooden hitching post beside a settler's wagon, splintering it in a burst of dust. Chaos exploded. Settlers dived for cover, some aiming wildly toward the ridge. Comanche warriors whirled their horses and pulled back from the open street, scanning for threats, unsure if this was a trick or an ambush. For a split second, it seemed everything would collapse into all-out war. But Tabai saw it clearly. From his horse, he pointed to the ridge and shouted in Comanche, rallying his warriors. "It's not them!" Rose screamed, her voice raw. "It's bandits! They're the raiders!" She turned, gesturing frantically. "They're the ones who've been stealing livestock dressed as Comanche to start a war." It clicked too late for some, just in time for others. The settlers turned toward the real enemy. Even Hargrove, his face twisted in confusion, dropped his sights from the Comanche and turned toward the masked attackers. "Mount up!" he bellowed. What followed was unlike anything Buckshot Springs had ever witnessed. Settlers and Comanche rode side by side, strange allies, forged by desperation and truth. The clash on the ridge was short but brutal. Bandits caught in their deception fought ferociously but without unity. A few fled. Most were shot or captured as the tide turned. Hargrove's men flanked them from the left, while Tabai's warriors looped from the right, surrounding the outlaws like a closing noose. When the last gunshot faded, a heavy silence fell. Rose rode up, heart-pounding eyes scanning the ridge. Two of the bandits were still alive, groaning from wounds. One had been shot in the leg and was already babbling about surrender. The other sat dazed, blood seeping from his shoulder. Tabai approached with grim focus, dismounting near one of the captured men. Takochi and his warriors remained poised nearby, weapons lowered but not stowed. Marshal Myers arrived moments later, having galloped from town with a few deputies. He took one look at the scene, the discarded bandit masks, the stolen cattle brands, and nodded grimly. "We've got our proof." And then came the moment no one expected. Tabai and Hargrove, opposites, in every way stood beside each other, sweat-soaked and dirt-streaked. Hargrove looked at him, nodded stiffly, and extended a hand. A long pause followed. Then slowly Tabai grasped it. The gesture didn't erase years of prejudice, but it cracked the door open. Behind them, settlers and Comanche mingled cautiously, eyeing one another with wariness, but also with something new recognition. They had nearly shed each other's blood. Instead, they had stood shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. Rose looked across the plains, her body aching from the tension of the day. Natok peeked from behind a Comanche horse, eyes wide, watching everything. When he spotted her, he smiled and she returned it, heart swelling. It felt like the first clean breath after a storm. Not peace, at least not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. In a land built on blood and dust, one selfless act had led to something neither side expected. A new dawn had broken over Buckshot Springs. The sun was dipping low, casting golden streaks across the prairie, as Marshal Eldon Myers sat beside one of the wounded bandits, his weathered notebook open pencil scratching. The outlaw, barely able to sit upright, winced with every breath, but finally confessed what many had suspected: they had posed as Comanche to raid cattle herds, burn property, and stoke the fire of war between settlers and tribes. Marshal Myers nodded grimly. "That explains the sudden uptick in raids. The war paint the tracks heading in both directions. They weren't trying to win a war. They were trying to start one and loot whatever was left." Word of the confession spread like wildfire. Buckshot Springs, once teetering on the edge of chaos, buzzed with disbelief and a mixture of relief and shame. The true enemy had been unmasked, not the Comanche, but men who sought to profit from hate. Rose stood near the jailhouse where the prisoners were kept, arms crossed, eyes distant. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of exhaustion, vindication, and sadness. So much could have been lost. One nervous trigger finger, one missed signal, and she would have had blood on her hands. Instead, the tide had turned, but barely. A quiet shuffle behind her broke her trance. Tabai approached Natok, walking beside him, still clutching the carved wooden horse Rose had given him days ago. The boy's small hand gripped his father's, but when he saw Rose he broke into a grin and ran forward. "Rose," he called, still struggling with English. He threw his arms around her waist, and she knelt to return the embrace, eyes stinging with emotion. "You're healing well," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. His scarred arm was now wrapped in fresh linen. The bite wound no longer raw, but still a visible reminder of what they'd survived together. Tabai watched silently, then stepped forward. "He speak of you every night," he said in halting English. "Call you protector." Rose looked up, surprised. "He's the brave one." He held on through everything. Behind them, more Comanche riders approached, among them Takochi, whose presence still commanded silence. As he dismounted, townspeople watched warily, but without the fear that had once gripped them. Children peered from behind mothers' skirts. Men stood with hats in hand, not in readiness to fight, but in an uneasy form of respect. Takochi glanced toward the jailhouse, then turned to Marshal Myers, who nodded and confirmed. They confessed. "Your people weren't to blame." He gestured to the cell. "Justice will be served." Takochi's expression softened a fraction. He turned to Rose and gave a single nod of acknowledgement. Not quite a bow, not quite a salute, but something deeply rooted in respect. A murmur rose among the settlers gathered around. Even Hargrove, once so full of bluster and hate, stood to the side, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of realization. He stepped forward awkwardly, removed his hat and addressed Tabai and Takochi. "I was wrong," he muttered, each word a pebble in his throat. "I misjudged. Nearly led us into a slaughter." He paused, then added, "I owe you. And this woman here. My life." The admission was met with silence, then the sound of someone clapping, Jeremiah Whitley, the town's gruff storekeeper. Others joined in, slowly at first, then louder. Not for Hargrove, but for what had been avoided. Applause for peace, however temporary. Natok tugged at Rose's sleeve and said something in Comanche. Tabai translated with a small smile. He asked if he can visit again. Bring toy to show brothers. Rose laughed, softly overwhelmed. He can visit any time. She looked toward Tom Jacobs, who stood beside Pete Montgomery, near the fence line. Tom held something wrapped in cloth, a fresh version of the wooden horse he'd carved earlier, more detailed now with a tiny braid in its mane. "Thought he might like a better one," Tom said, handing it to Rose. She unwrapped it and offered it to Natok, who gasped in delight and hugged it close like treasure. Tabai murmured something in his son's ear. The boy turned and said, "Thank you with effort, but clearly." Before the Comanche left, Takochi approached Rose once more and offered a necklace made of bone and turquoise. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a tribal symbol, something between warriors or those who had earned respect in the eyes of the people. "For spirit," he said, placing it gently in her hand. "You save child. You speak truth. You... not enemy." Rose clasped it to her chest. "Neither are you." With that, the Comanche mounted their horses. As they rode out, the settlers watched not with fear, but with quiet reverence. The wind seemed to shift not as harsh as before. The tension had lessened, not gone, but replaced with something else possibility. Pete turned to Rose and asked, "You think it'll last?" Rose looked out across the horizon, where the silhouettes of riders faded into the golden dust. "If we keep choosing understanding over fear, maybe." As the last rays of sun bathed the Wilcox Ranch and the town in warm light, Natok turned to wave one final time from his perch behind his father. Rose lifted her hand in return, smiling. It wasn't the end of conflict on the frontier, but it was a new beginning. In the days that followed the dramatic standoff and the joint raid on the ridge, the truth spilled forth like water over dry stone. Under Marshal Eldon Myers's interrogation, one of the captured bandits, his leg splinted crudely, and his pride more broken than his body, confessed everything. The scheme had been simple, but deadly raid ranches while disguised in Comanche war paint spark conflict between settlers and tribes, and then loot the chaos. "Stir up enough blood," he muttered, "and no one stops to ask who really fired the first shot." The town of Buckshot Springs reeled. Men who once beat their chests and called for war now avoided eye contact. Mothers who had hidden their children during the near massacre hugged them a little tighter. The threat had never been the Comanche, it had been the hatred festering in fear waiting for a spark. And someone had tried to strike that spark on purpose. Rose stood quietly beside the jailhouse, watching as Marshal Myers secured the prisoners. Her heart was heavy, but not with regret. She had followed her conscience, and in doing so had saved more than just Natok. She had spared the town from a war it would not have survived. From the dusty road came the rhythmic beat of hooves. Tabai approached on horseback, Natok riding in front of him, his arms loosely around his father's waist. When they reached Rose, the boy immediately slid down and ran to her with a grin. The bandages on his arm had been replaced with a fresh wrap, and a small scar peeked through the edge. "Rose," he called in a cheerful burst of English. She bent down to embrace him, smiling warmly. "You're healing up strong," she said, ruffling his hair. "Braver than most grown men I know." Tabai dismounted and approached her with quiet dignity. "He speak of you every day," he said, his English deliberate. "Says you are his brave mother spirit." The words hit her like a gust of wind. She swallowed hard and nodded. "And he's part of my story now. Always." The townspeople began to gather again, not in fear this time, but in quiet curiosity. Behind Tabai came Takochi and a small group of warriors. They rode without fanfare or threat, bearing no raised weapons, only solemn faces and an air of watchfulness. It was the first time many settlers had seen Comanche approach without dread curling in their guts. Marshal Myers met them halfway, tipping his hat. "The guilty men are in custody," he said plainly. They confessed. "We owe you an apology." Takochi gave a nod, not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement. His gaze moved to Rose. After a moment of stillness, he reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a simple necklace of bone and turquoise. He held it out. "For strength," he said. "For heart." Rose accepted it reverently, fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll wear it with pride." Even Hargrove, standing off to the side, removed his hat and approached. His steps were slow, as though each one fought against a mountain of pride. "I spoke out of turn," he said, not quite meeting Tabaya's eyes. "Didn't see the truth soon enough. I'm sorry." The apology was met with silence, but not hostility. Sometimes silence meant a door hadn't closed. Before leaving, Natok reached into his satchel and pulled out the small wooden horse Rose had once given him, now worn from travel and tightly gripped in his little hand. He offered it back. She knelt. "No, you keep it," she said softly. "So you always remember someone is thinking of you." He smiled, hugged her tightly, then turned back to his father. As the Comanche riders headed for the horizon, the townspeople watched, not with fear, but with awe. Rose remained standing long after they disappeared from sight. Something had changed, not just in the town, but in the land itself. Thank you for staying until the very end of this unforgettable Wild West tale. Rosanna Rose, Wilcox's act of compassion bridged the chasm between settler and Comanche when she saved a frightened child, proving that trust can bloom in the harshest deserts. We hope you were drawn into the dust and drama of Buckshot Springs, felt the thunder of hooves across the plains, and sensed the electricity of a showdown that almost tore the region apart. But out of that chaos came unity and a glimmer of hope. If this story inspired you, or if the suspense had you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button, share it with fellow fans of frontier adventures, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. We've got plenty more riveting tales from history, legend, and beyond. Your support helps us keep storytelling alive. Thank you, and see you next time.